Zirvemizin ikinci gününün ikinci oturumunu başlatıyoruz artık. Yemek molamızdan sonra yine blok zinciri konuşmaya devam edeceğiz detaylı şekilde. Çok kıymetli bir konuğumuz var. Bu kez blok zincirin güvenliği, gizliliği ve ölçeklenebilirliği ile başlıyoruz. Sonrasında yine devam edecek oturumlarımız ama ben bilim dünyasını çok yakından tanıdığı çok değerli bir ismi şimdi sahneye davet etmek istiyorum. Stanford Üniversitesi'nden Prof.Dr. Whitfield Diffie bizlerle. Alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum kendisini.
Before I begin talking, let me say something I don't want to forget. They're very worried about permission to reproduce or use the things that I say. So I wanted to explain, I talk in terms of what's called copyleft. Anyone who is watching this is welcome to record it. Anyone who has a recording is welcome to redistribute it under the same terms. So you may make any use of it you like, and you can't restrict other people making use of it. That said, it is wonderful to be back in Istanbul. I have not been here. In 2008, I was here for a meeting of the International Association for Cryptologic Research, and I have not been here since. Every year or two, something looms and I think about it, but it hasn't happened before this. So thank you so much for inviting me here. So the title may or may not describe what I have to say. It's better than a title, a few random thoughts. But it has several threads I will try to weave together, and I hope you will enjoy it. Somebody asked me just before this what my broad view was, and I said, be patient. I'm going to tell them that. Basically, I see blockchain as one of several elements of a very broad program that with no precedent in 7,000 years. That's about when humans moved from living in the countryside and began living in cities. And the really important thing about living in a city is that you're no longer living in a natural environment. You're living in an environment that people created. And that means lots of things that were just facts of life become matters of policy. And this becomes more and more true as time goes on. So today, we are moving our society into cyberspace. Now, I know perfectly well it won't fit, right? I mean, that I understand. But it also won't fit into cities. Cities have to be supported by farmland surrounding and things like that. But the most essential component of our civilization is moving into digital communication channels. And the events of the last 2 years have certainly pushed this along. So, now what are we doing? We look around. We find that we have lots of things that we are familiar with doing. We have a new medium in which we want to do them, and we try to find equivalents. So we call the traditional things brick and mortar in English. The particular thing that the internet represents is communication, and the particular thing to which we see blockchain contributing is business practices, especially accounting. Now, I want to start saying something, there's a great paradox in a lot of this. Because for years, people have been saying, if land were free or if food were free, there would be no wars. I rather doubt that. And in fact, with the introduction of an information society, information is cheaply copyable, lots of things could be free. The response is to try to make them expensive so that you can sell them. And I don't necessarily see a solution to that. I mean, telling everybody just not to be greedy won't work. But I see it as one of the most important problems that we face. So, let me go through things that you already know so I can get on to things I hope you don't know. What are the objectives of blockchain? Well, we call it distributed accounting. And by distributed, we really mean distribution of the authority as opposed to the instrumentation. We want to make the relationships among things visible and verifiable. So we want something as a basic, kind of the journal level of our accounting to be something that operates in a tamper-resistant way entirely publicly. And as it happens, I don't know if it's as essential, but we have used blockchains to implement commodities. Bitcoin was originally intended to be a money. It seems to me fails entirely as money, but it's utterly amazing for what it has done, being the prototype, apparently having its developer die, disappear, and yet being so alive in the world today. Okay. So we're trying to avoid something that we've had for a long time, which is that we need, in order to synchronize a number of separate things, we need a central facility that does the synchronization. And that, there are quite a number of examples of that. I mean, census bureaus centralize information about populations. Patent offices centralize information about inventions. Central banks centralize the control of money, and credit card systems centralize information about who is buying what, who can be lent money, etc. The problem with this is, if you have a central resource, right, at some point it's likely to require rescaling, and that can be very expensive. Right? I mean, you have, for example, a computer of some kind, and suddenly you need to go out and buy twice as large. And so the more that you can distribute these phenomena, the more you can scale them without being surprised. The centralization of authority is both bad in itself, right? And some's like, if you have a democratic view, you want the people as a whole basically to be controlling things. When you create central concentrations of power, they can be abused in many ways. And they give a tremendous problem, one, of reliability. I mean, if the center fails, then the thing it is doing fails. And two, if the center is worth attacking and taking over, then you have a major security problem. So one of the things that is going on, rather beyond, I think, what we're talking about here, been going on for several centuries, is things were beyond human control. Right? I mean, human beings had very little control over the supply of gold. Oh yes, of course. At times some gold was discovered, and uniformly gold keeps being lost and going away and so forth. But gold had a sort of inherent value, and it has been replaced by fiat currencies that are under the control of governments. And that is sort of, in my view, a mixed blessing. But I think many of us miss having an objective medium of trade that is beyond anybody's control. And I guess the best I can say is, why is gold valuable? Because at every moment people think it is. So we're trying to find another phenomenon that enjoys that same popularity, that at every moment people think this thing is valuable. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears. And what I largely intend to talk about here is the way cryptography has been used in blockchain and the challenge to cryptography today from quantum computing and how these things are related to each other. So starting very broadly, I write down a definition of cryptography. It's a matter of taking useful, comprehensible data and transforming it into useless, incomprehensible ciphertext. And the critical point is, it has traditionally involved secrets. And secrets immediately present a problem. Right? Basically, if you were depending on a secret, you have a vulnerability. Right? The secret can leak. So one of the big trends in cryptography is to try to reduce the amount that you have to keep secret. And blockchains are one of the big successes in that direction. Okay. Now, I always like to do a little history. I think you understand where things are going by understanding where they have come from and what produces changes. So the first thing, in my view of the history here, is that literally, and of course, people have had cryptography for thousands of years. You can find records of things you can reasonably call cryptography, certainly in ancient Greece, maybe in ancient Egypt. But what I will call modern cryptography, and I'll show you in a moment why I say that, is at most, as far as we can discover, 1,200 years old. It dates from Baghdad, important philosopher named Al-Kindi. And very little was known about that until the last 20 or 30 years. Documents about it it was known of because later documents referred to the earlier ones, but I'm told that more original documents have been found in libraries in the Middle East, and that is all coming to be better understood. I am not a scholar of it. But what is much more widely known, certainly in the Western European world, is the discovery of the same principles in Italy only about 500 years ago. Whether there's any connection, incidentally, is very hard to establish. I initially thought there was, because after all, Europe and the Middle East fought a big set of wars with each other about 1,000 years ago, but I can't trace that to anything. So the key point was that before that, pretty much ciphers had been called what are called monoalphabetic substitution. Now, you turn an A into a Q and a B into a D and a C into an R, and you keep that the same for quite some period of time. And these people developed analytic methods for breaking systems of that kind, and systems rather more complex than that. And they concluded that what you have to do is change the cipher alphabet, the substitution table, from one character to the next. So if A goes to Q in the first place, if there's another A in the second place, it goes to N or something else. And the way in which they did this made use of two basic phenomena. Table lookups, they call them called tables cipher alphabets in cryptography, and some kind of arithmetic, usually modular arithmetic, like a clock. Get around to 24 and start again with 0. And the reason I call it modern is because you have those same two phenomena. If you look at the advanced encryption standard, a Belgian design standard adopted by the US 20 years ago, you find the same things. Now, they're a little fancier than you could do by hand. The lookup table is of size 256, so 256 byte table, and the arithmetic is Galois arithmetic. We get the mathematics all the way up to the 19th century, but you still have those same basic two elements. Okay. So given that, I mean, you know, you ought to respond, hey, why are you making a living in cryptography? I mean, you know, all of this should have developed hundreds of years ago. And the answer is, well, it's ahead of its time because you really couldn't do it without computing. You don't need as fancy a computers as we have today, but you needed good mechanical machining, or very nice to have electricity, and you could make electromechanical mechanisms that did this for you. Now, in other venues, I love to discuss the development of cryptography throughout the 20th century, but here I'm just going to touch on it. Oh, no, I'm going to touch on something else first. If you're only interested in using cryptography, not in doing research in it, then there really is very little you need to know. Right? So, the virtue of cryptography as a security mechanism is that you don't have to guard the paths that messages take. Right? So imagine two cases, right? I mean, if you have a building and you're trying to protect the phone calls within the building, yeah, it's fine. Just, you know, lock the building, shield the building, guard the building, whatever. If you have a small company with an office in Beijing and an office in Istanbul and an office in Paris, well, then there's no possible way of guarding the wires going between those places. And it gets worse, of course, if you want to use radios, you want to fly satellites and things like that. So you need a method of protecting things that does not depend on guarding the paths. And that means, in particular, that you can pass messages right through the hands directly of your opponents. So certificates and such are handed, you know, you receive them from people you don't trust, and by studying the certificate, you come to trust them because you trust the tamper resistance of the certificate. And the result is that cryptography acts like an amplifier. Remember, it has secret keys, and what you do is you take the security or the insecurity of a key that's a few hundred bits, and you amplify that so that it becomes the security or the insecurity of billions of bytes of data. Okay, well, if you come to a more sensible, less wit-centric notion of modern, you come to the 20th century. And the first big explosion of cryptography was in World War I, for two reasons. One, that was the first war fought by radio. Right? I mean, the first transatlantic radio transmission was, I think, 1903. And there were people who understood radio, Popov and such in Russia understood radio phenomena earlier than that, but they couldn't really use it for a lot. By the time you get up to World War I, it becomes an essential thing, particularly for the military. It's clearest in the Navy. Right? 1900, the first Sea Lord of Britain commanded the greatest fleet in the world, and he didn't know where it was. After the introduction of radio, it took quite a number of years, but gradually the amount of time it took to find and contact a ship went from, you know, months to weeks to days to minutes. And the only ones you really have to wait a while to find these days maybe are some submarines. The other point is that by World War I, they had good enough machining to begin to make cryptographic devices. They didn't really play any role in that war itself, but that got the inventors all excited, and they began making these things. World War II, they're now extensively using the kind of machines they envisioned in World War I, and electronics, things involving vacuum tubes, have become good enough that they can now build begin building equipment of that sort. Subsequently, if you look up to the 60s, we're still building things out of electronics. Now it's transistors, but they look much more like computers. Single instruction fetch cycle of a computer, it has a several bit wide path that sort of keeps running around through it. And cryptographic systems look very similar to that. And finally, roughly the 1980s, you get to where you are doing, everybody has given in and begun doing cryptography using software, and that means whatever mathematical idea you have that you want to be part of your cryptography, you can implement it. Earlier things are done by doing for cryptography what you think, what you can do with the things you have. Now, I want to mention only two crypto systems along here. The first one is one that's never thought of as very good. I consider this one of the great discoveries of 20th century cryptography. Now, luckily for the US and its alliance, they didn't do a very good job of it. But the insight, most of the good cryptographic devices at that time were made using something called rotors, which are Bakelite wheels with electrical contacts on them and wires running through the inside, and nobody but cryptographers cares anything about them. That means you have to develop them out of the cryptographic budget, which isn't very large. The Japanese saw the correct thing, a correct thing to do, a wonderful thing to do. They built it out of what were called telephone stepping switches. There's a picture. That's a picture of the only surviving piece of that equipment. It's not a complete object. It's just three little stepping switches. But stepping switches sit, and if you imagine a stack of clock faces, so the wires come in at the center and then they go out on the edge wherever the hands of the clock are pointing. That's basically how those things work. What is important is not so much how they work, beyond that they will do the job, but that they were used in the tens of thousands to build telephone central offices. And the result is they were cheaper, they were incredibly reliable, and you don't have to develop them. You develop them out of the much larger total communications budget. And then apply them to cryptography, and you're able to do cryptography much cheaper. That's pretty much the same thing that people have in mind today. You look at cryptographic systems that are based on the 32-bit multiplier. That's because the 32-bit multiplier is in all of the computers. You don't have to design it. You don't have to build it, right? You have it available. And that, to my mind, is as an important a principle as there is in engineering design in general, but certainly in cryptography. Okay, here's the one other one I'll show you. That is the world's first digital telephone. That's a room not quite as large as this. Clearly the ceiling is much lower. And that digital telephone not only wouldn't fit in your pocket, it was so expensive that only Churchill and Roosevelt could afford to have one initially. Ultimately, there were made maybe about 12 of them. And the fact that it encrypts the telephone call is incidental by comparison. All those cabinets are basically devoted to digitizing the telephone call. And it's curiously similar to some secure telephones of the last, few decades. I mean, it uses 2,400 bit per second linear predictive coding, much lower data rate than our telephones, but something that would go over very poor telephone wires and was used extensively in secure telephony. Okay. Getting on closer to the point, in the 1950s, people were developing cryptographic equipment with out of transistors. The mainstream concern, sort of in the US and NATO and such, was speed. That thing I showed you on the previous slide had shown you could encrypt at much faster than teletype rates. And now everybody wanted secure voice, secure video, secure satellites, etc. But something else was happening quietly, which was a transition from doing things one character at a time, a view that goes all the way back to Alberti and Al-Kindi, and operating on large blocks of data all at once, which is, in fact, what you need for blockchains. And if you look around the world today, well, I put the first one's historical. The US introduced, as far as I know, the first public cryptographic standard in 1977. It introduced its successor, which is a US standard, but it's a Belgian-designed system. And that was an absolutely wonderful benchmark. That was a transition from the complete nationalism of the cryptographic organizations to being open enough to adopt something designed in another country. And those last two, there's a similar Russian standard and a similar Chinese standard, all systems that operate on 128 bits at a time. The other thing that came in the latter 20th century, first proposed, I think, in the 50s for what Unix does with it, which is encrypting passwords, were hash functions. And this became a major subject in cryptography sort of in the 80s and 90s. And Ron Rivest, who incidentally held his retirement party from MIT yesterday. I've had a busy week, and that's what I did with Friday. He designed one called Message Digest 5. I like the term Message Digest, but in spite of his using that term, or maybe because of it, the National Institute of Standards and Technology called it a secure hash algorithm. And it's standardized, well, the hash is a third, but I didn't bother to write it down. But these are what you use largely in blockchains. And smallest useful one operates on 256 bits, but they go up much higher than that, certainly to 512. And those particular ones were designed by NSA, the US Signals Intelligence Spying Organization. There's a third one, was developed by NIST in another international contest, but it's sort of on the shelf for the moment. I don't think it's being widely used. It operates in a very different fashion from the others, which means one could shift in principle if some of the others were broken. Okay. Getting to another direction here, what I made my living on is something called public key cryptography. You make less of the cryptographic system secret than before. You now have something you hand out publicly that is either directly is a key or that's used to manufacture a key. And the critical thing that you can do with this is digital signatures. Right? So a digital signature is, I can give you a pure digital piece of information that gives you evidence that you can pass on to somebody else that I told you something, that I signed a document. And anybody in the community will be able to recognize that. I think this is one of our successes in achieving in the digital world the kind of phenomena that we are used to in the material world. Okay. Now, it was interesting, right? The aforementioned Rivest, together with two other people named Shamir Nadelman, Marty Hellman and I, and Taher El-Gamal, all did work on this in the 70s, which persists. And it's just meeting proposed alternatives now. Now, which leads us to blockchains depend sometimes on both kinds of cryptography. That is, they're built in essence out of hash functions, but they depend on signatures to play the signature role, to say pieces of the chain are being offered by somebody or other. And that all dates, the hash trees date to Ralph Merkle. I described him, somebody here asked me to sign a copy of a paper called The First 10 Years of Public Key Cryptography, and I said in that paper, now enters the most imaginative character in the public key saga. So that's a Merkle tree. I know you're all more familiar with them than I am. It allows you to hand out a signature for a leaf with about a log of the number of elements in the tree of information. And what's at the bottom there is called a root. Turns out, in your world, it's called a block. Now, that hung on for 30 years or something before much happened with it. In the late 1990s, Stuart Haber and Ariane Lenstra started a service for time-stamping digital documents. And it built, every week, it builds a Merkle tree of signatures. And at the end of the week, it publishes the root, the block, in the New York Times. Right? Now, it's making use of the fact that the circulation of the Times is more than 1 million, right? Something is correctly, I don't know if there have ever been any errors incidentally. There are always errors in typesetting, and I don't know if they've suffered from errors in the Times. But basically, if they get the root into the Times correctly, then anybody who wants to verify a timestamp from that week needs merely to go to the Times and look it up. And since there are so many million copies of the Times, it would be very hard to phony it. Now, this is a long way toward what we wanted, but on the other hand, it still has this physical machinery in it. So the essence of the blockchain transition is that we replace the New York Times with a constant discussion among the players in the game. And so the time now goes down from a week to, minutes. And every few minutes, you can resolve that everybody is agreed on what the current block is. And each one is tied to the previous one. Okay. Now, the problem is that this sort of technology also depends on signatures. So you have to be concerned with the security of RSA and El-Gamal and elliptic curve. And I'm going to focus on RSA as the easiest one to look at here. So that's the RSA system. I expect lots of people know it. I'm not going to discuss it in any detail. It involves raising, you have a message, you raise it to an exponent, is the encrypting mechanism. And what is public, right, you raise it to an exponent modulo a product of two large prime numbers. And the big secret is what the prime numbers are. Well, that's one way of viewing the secret. Okay. Why does it work? Well, multiplying is easy, right? Your 32-bit multiplier will do 1 billion of them a second or something. You're building, using that as a digit and building much larger multipliers, but you still do it quite quickly. Exponentiation is easy. In fact, curiously, it's embodied in the Roman numeral system of multiplication by doubling, but apparently Carl Friedrich Gauss in the 19th century I'm told, didn't understand that it was easy. So things can get lost in mathematics. Finding primes is sort of easy. I mean, it actually takes equivalent of hundreds of these encryptions, but you only have to do it when you're manufacturing keying material. You don't have to do it with every message. What's really hard, for the size numbers we use these days, out of anybody's reach, is factoring. If you know the product of the numbers, that's one thing. There's no way of finding out the numbers themselves. And currently numbers have been factored up to, 750 bits or so, and what's being used is 2,000 or 3,000 bits. So one view is the secret of the factors. The factors are actually important because they create a number that's p minus 1 times q minus 1, and it's the number of invertible elements within the ring, and this is all mathematical jargon. It's actually not very complicated. But the critical thing about that is it forms a cycle. And cycles are critical here. So notice how public key is different from conventional. If I give you a ciphertext message in AES, right? You don't know the key. There's nothing you can do to produce another message that's somehow interestingly related to it. But if I give you a message in a public key system and you know the public key, well, then you can continue encrypting it. And if you continue encrypting it long enough, you're going to get back to where you started. Right? And so in particular, this big secret is how far, in effect, when you would get back. So it's going back that's hard, but the whole thing has a lot in common with a racetrack. Right? For 5 points, tell me what track that is. Now, you're standing on the track, and you'd like to go back a step, right? But that isn't a good idea. They're right behind you. Right? But you could go forward around the track. And in fact, with exponentiation, you can go forward very fast. Right? So if you can it takes you 30 times as long to take 1 billion steps as it does to take 1 step. So you can go zoop, 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 zoop around the track as much as you like. The trouble is, you'd like to get to the place behind where you were. But if you don't know how long the track is, you have no idea where you are. Right? So it's a little like, imagine you could move very fast around lines of latitude, except you didn't know what line of latitude you were on. So you don't know if you're buzzing around at the North Pole or running around slowly at the equator. And so if you have a way of finding out the length of the cycle, then you can reverse the encryption. So something called Shor's algorithm, Shor wrote a paper in 1997 about it, using quantum computing, finds cycle lengths, and that will tell you how far to go. It's been promised to us for about 30 years. The physicists began saying they could do it in 1990. Lots of money has been invested in it. And if it comes through, it will break public key systems, and in particular, signatures. The way it works, right, it sort of gives you vast parallelism, because each bit is not a 0 or 1. Each bit is a probability that is somewhere between 0 and 1. And as the system operates, the probabilities settle down and to where they, drift up, become 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, get too close to 1, and you can say, okay, this thing has coalesced, converged, something like that. Nobody can get machines to do that yet with any reliability. You need several thousand of these qubits, and I don't know, they're up in the dozens maybe. Okay, however, a lot of people take the threat of this very seriously. And there are two I'm going to discuss, and one is the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US. And it has this pretty logo for its project. If you look at that carefully, you find sort of all of the elements of what they're working on. And July 5th, they put out a set of proposed standards. The mechanism is they propose standards, and there's some period of time to comment on the standards, and they respond to the comments by developing new standards. And at some point, they become actually signed by the Secretary of Commerce and issued. We're not close to that yet. And those are systems that operate in ways entirely different from the number theory that's used in the 3 systems I described before. And in particular, they depend on a problem called lattice minimization. Now, more recently, about 3 weeks ago, National Security Agency announced, and also not final apparently, but a set of standards. And when you notice something, it contains some of the same ones. Those things called crystal dilithium and crystal kyber, those are the same. It contains symmetric systems I've discussed, the advanced encryption standard and the secure hash algorithms. But interestingly, it adds something out of the blockchain world, namely Merkle trees, Merkle signatures. And this is part of this trend. Right? One, the hash functions are quantum resistant. And don't have to worry about those. And when you can do signatures without having secret keys, you have the gain that the keys can't leak. So the two subjects are tied together. And as far as I can see, the development of cryptography, development of blockchains are entirely intertwined. Thank you very much. Usually somebody comes up to throw me off the stage, but maybe I'm expected to leave by myself.